If you like Swedish candy, you have probably already had some of the candies that were in the thumbnail for this video, which included Maribou, Kex, and even those blue and yellow or blue and pink and black and pink skulls that are sometimes even licorice. So for this video, I actually wanted to give you some insight into candies that you might not necessarily see abroad. So to do that, I went to Karla Frukt, which is a fruit stand that opened in 1928 in Stockholm's Östermalm, that over time has actually become a candy shop, which is where I went for this video to find some of those candies that you might not necessarily see abroad. And I'm no expert, and I've only lived in Sweden for a few years, so I don't necessarily know if you can get these candies abroad. But for the sake of this video, I wanted to show you some of my favorite that I would always go for here in Stockholm. So like I mentioned, if you don't live in Stockholm or if you don't live in another Scandinavian city, you probably would have already had many of the candies that I talked about a moment ago. Or if you're really lucky, you live next to a Swedish candy store in whatever city you live in, or maybe you spent a bunch of money on ordering one of those like themed boxes that I saw a lot on YouTube and researching for this video, which, by the way, if you are spending more than like $10 on Swedish candy from one of those stores, just know that that store is making a ton of profit on you, because most Swedish candy you can spend maybe 30, 50, or even 60 Swedish kroner, which is roughly like $5 to $6, and get a ton of candy. So the candy itself is not meant to be really expensive, and kids eat it all the time, as I'm sure you've learned from one of those other videos. But one of the candies I really liked is this caramel from this shop here in Stockholm called Pärlans. And in the summer, they have this amazing soft serve and that they put caramel on. So yeah, this one's actually another favorite of mine. And another one that I really like is this vanilla fudge, and it usually comes in a couple different flavors. And I'll talk about this a little bit later in the video, but I love fudge, and I think it has to do with my upbringing in California, where my grandpa used to make this. So I always kind of reach for some fudge here if I'm ever buying candy for maybe Melodifestivalen, or if I'm going to the cinemas, which is usually where I eat the most candy. And lastly, there are these skulls, which you've already had, and they're from this producer called Bubs here in Stockholm, or here in Sweden, I should say. And these are pretty common, and to get these candies, I actually had to like fight off a couple of kids because they were almost out. And these are the candies actually later in the video I'll talk about that the producers of these candies actually had a shortage last year in 2023. So yeah, those are some of my favorite candies that I'll reach for, and some of them are pretty common. You would have had some of them, but the others I think are pretty unique to Stockholm, or maybe you can get them at a specialty like candy store or a specialty shop wherever you might live. But since we're talking about candy, I thought I'd give you a little bit of history about sugar in Sweden. Honey, much like any other place in the world, was the primary sweetener in Sweden until like the 16th and 17th century. And that's because obviously Sweden's cold, so they can't really grow candy cane here, which meant that it was imported. And because it was imported, it was really only for the rich. And the first record where Sweden can confidently say that sugar was in Sweden was in 1327 at the birth of Saint Birgitta's father. And by the way, Saint Birgitta is a patron saint of Sweden, and she was also connected to the aristocratic families of Sweden, which there weren't like a ton at the time. And her father was buried, and he basically had it in his will that everyone should actually be eating sugar, or they should be offering sugar at his burial. And it was actually even Gustav Vasa at his death in 1560, where he had like pretty bad teeth. And there were doctors at the time were actually using sugar as a sort of medicine to kind of cure some of the illnesses that he had. So yeah, Gustav Vasa, much like Saint Birgitta's father, was a little sockergris. I'm just chiming in to say that if you are enjoying this video, please give me a thumbs up. So I mentioned earlier in the video some candies that you probably can only get here in Sweden. And those candies happen to also be a lot of my favorite candies. I'm not super adventurous when it comes to candy. I'm pretty much like chocolates, caramels, things that are maybe even a little bit of salty and sweet, but I'm never really into like lots of sour things. And I think that's because a lot of the candy I actually like here in Sweden are the candies that remind me of my childhood. I grew up in California, which meant that the only times that we really had candy was when we were doing road trips to Santa Cruz, because there's a candy shop in Santa Cruz that my mother and father really liked, or we were having candy during the holidays, like Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I think I like fudge because my grandpa used to make lots of different flavors of fudge. So Anytime I have fudge, I always think about him, which is why I think I like it. But the other two, in terms of chocolates and caramels, is certainly because of those road trips where this particular confectionery shop in Santa Cruz, which I'll put a link in the description, so that if you do want to order it, if you do live in America, they're pretty great. They serve saltwater taffy, which I've actually never seen in Sweden, but it's a particular type of taffy that's really chewy that is just so nice, and there's tons of flavor. So I think my tasting candy really come from that time in my life. But in the topic of like Sweden's like pick and mix, where you might see online and a lot of those videos about like viral Swedish candy, I think the first time that my husband ever saw them is when we went to one of those kind of Swedish design shops on Abbot Kinney in Venice, which is a neighborhood in LA. And there's a Swedish shop that I believe was owned by Swedish twins. I can't remember, but I'll go to find the link and put it in the description. But was the first time that he ever had both Swedish candy, but also this kind of typical pick and mix situation, which honestly, if you live in Sweden or if you come and visit Sweden, you actually see them everywhere. And I think that's why I find this whole craze about Swedish candy so strange, is because if I leave my apartment within 3 minutes, I can go get candy from my local grocery store, and specifically candy from like the pick and mix. So it's super common in Sweden, and I think you kind of forget how much there is actually available to us here. And I think all this access to candy has made me kind of turn my head a little bit when I see all of these like viral Swedish trends about candy, because it is so commonly available here. I didn't read anything in the news about candy shortages in Sweden in 2013. And for this video, I had to actually like go and hunt for some news sources that had anything about Swedish candy. And I found a video on YouTube and one article. But basically what happened is in 2013, when the world was kind of waking up to the fantastic Swedish candy, it created a shortage because the trend kind of started right before summer break. And the manufacturer Orkla, which owns Bubs, they had to send all of their kind of like reserve storage abroad, which meant that because this craze was happening right before summer, it meant that there was actually like no production of candy until they came back, which meant that here at home in Sweden, there were some shortages. But honestly, I don't remember any shortages in the fall of last year, but if you are watching this video and you live here in Sweden, can you comment to say, one, did you actually like have any shortages, or did you observe any shortages? But also maybe what your favorite Swedish candy is, and that maybe I should try. So yeah, I didn't read a lot about it, and I didn't even notice a lot of it here in Sweden. So I guess, there's plenty to go around here. So do I think that Swedish candy is worth your time? Yeah, totally. I mean, Swedish candy, there are some unique ones, but there are a lot that remind me of candies back in the US. So I would say that if you live next to a Swedish store or a Swedish candy store, or you live next to an IKEA, I would say maybe like go for the stuff that you probably haven't seen, because I think that's what makes Swedish candy really fun, is that there's so much variety, as well as stuff that reminds me of things back home in America. So with that said, thank you so much for watching this episode of Managing Expectations.